Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today I wanted to take a first look at the global Uranus returns that we will be experiencing in the coming years for many nations, as well as the biggest international organizations, and at least give this a somewhat cursory first look as we continue to dig into it in future videos as part of the context of the massive global changes that we are going to be experiencing starting this year and next year, as we have all of the outer planets changing signs almost simultaneously. So I will probably dig into this more in a future video, but I wanted to at least give us an initial look at all of this because it's something that's been on my mind quite a bit, and I haven't really been seeing it be addressed in this context of not only is Uranus changing signs, but that means that in terms of national Uranus returns, all of those post-war countries are going to be experiencing their Uranus returns. There's a ton of nations that have Uranus and Gemini. So before we get into it, if you are new here, please do consider sticking around by subscribing. We cover a lot of astrology like this, mundane astrology, with regard to culture, politics, geopolitics, and we also dig into long-term or very significant transits here as well. I am going to be starting to do live streaming, I believe, this Sunday, but don't quote me on that. Going forward on Sundays, certainly, I will be doing weekly live streams. I think I want to combine that with our weekly forecast. So if you have any thoughts on that or preferences, definitely let me know. But if you are new here, do consider sticking around by subscribing. I would love to have you here for future videos. And if you don't mind giving this video a thumbs up, I would really appreciate that. It helps me out with the algorithm. It shows the video to more people if more people like it. And so it helps the channel to grow and it helps the video to spread around to new people. So with all of that said, let's dig into this. One thing that is a bit of an aside, but did really stand out to me is that I wanted to look at, okay, which countries have Uranus and Taurus? So which countries have been going through their Uranus returns since 2018, as we've had Uranus and Taurus? Not really many, surprisingly. I looked at the past two, at least, Uranus in Taurus periods, and there's not a lot of nation formation during those periods of time. Now, we do need to consider that for any given nation, there might be more than one chart to consider, and that will be quite evident with some of the countries that we're looking at here. But in terms of nations that have significant charts with Uranus in Taurus, I was only able to find Nepal. So they have been experiencing their Uranus return. And that actually is not terribly surprising. I know that Nepal has been experiencing a lot of changes in recent years as it has become kind of a trendy sort of hotspot for, let's say, Western Buddhists to go and visit and to tour. And of course, more than that. It's always been more than that. But that is something that they've been experiencing in recent years to a huge extent. So they've certainly been experiencing a major change in really the way that their nation is seen. It is a topic of conversation more certainly than it used to be before 2018 for quite a while globally. And in terms of their economy, which is growing quite a bit, in terms of the pressures that they are receiving culturally, certainly, and possibly politically, but I haven't seen that quite as much. Maybe if there are people who are a little bit more deeply familiar with Nepal, they can elucidate on that topic a bit in the comments as well. But they're really the only country, fortunately, because if things had gone very differently in World War II, then we probably would have a different country considering a Uranus and Taurus period to be a foundational period for them, which would be Germany. And that's one reason why I'm actually kind of pleased to see that there aren't a lot of nations with Uranus and Taurus, because it does seem to have a rather, historically speaking, as someone in 2024 with a relatively, therefore, limited perspective on history in terms of the national charts that we use, tend to be those which have been created within the past several centuries. And so what we've seen with Uranus and Taurus in recent centuries is a lot of control, a lot of centralized control, and the kinds of tendencies. So think of, the antebellum South, that a lot of that played out in its worst ways throughout the Uranus and Taurus period that led up to the Civil War, which occurred with Uranus and Gemini. But additionally, the tyranny that was perceived to be coming from, for instance, Britain. And again, I'm also coming from a very US perspective, so do understand that. But the kind of tyranny that was perceived here that caused, with Uranus and Gemini, the US to have a revolutionary war and kind of overthrow that order here. Additionally, we of course saw that with Uranus and Taurus in Europe, and in many ways, because there was, during that period, certainly colonization has always been pretty horrendous, but for some reason, it's always toward the end, it's always darkest before the dawn. And there was a lot of deep-seated hatred and abuse that came from Western European powers over their colonial holdings. And then, of course, we also had, during that period of time, the Third Reich come into power. We had Italy go fascist, we had Spain go fascist, I think maybe a little bit before that period of time, but additionally, Japan really started ramping up abuses upon its neighbors as well. And so it's certainly maybe not a terrible thing that we don't have a lot of nations with Uranus and Taurus. And obviously, Nepal is just fine in terms of all of those issues. But it does bring a certain additional fascination for us with the fact that we haven't been having very many nations go through Uranus returns very recently. So I did want to point that out. Additionally, this will play out for certain countries a little bit differently in terms of where Uranus is in the chart in terms of its house placement. So Uranus in Gemini is a common theme of all of the countries that we'll be talking about, but that placement will be in different houses for various countries. So it'll be interesting to look at where that plays out, and that can give us a little bit more insight into how these countries will be most strongly impacted by this. One thing that I have seen with Uranus in Gemini, especially as I've been going through and not just looking at this from the perspective of the fact that this is a placement that the United States has, but looking through, okay, what are all of the recent countries that have this? And I did take this back 3. The closest that we have in between, it's US, and no one else during that period of time that I could find. There was a little bit more of an Italian state that was created in the 1860s. I'm not completely familiar with that, but they weren't unified. And then from then on, it was just in the 1940s that we have all of these states that were created. So I do want to point that out. But a lot of these nations are quite pluralistic. So we do have some nations that have some troubles with that. Of course, the US being among them, we have struggled with that quite a bit, though we do call ourselves a melting pot because we somewhat pride ourselves, on the fact that we at least see ourselves as pluralistic. Let's put it that way. But for instance, some of the countries that we'll be looking at, Myanmar, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka in particular, since this time, maybe have struggled a little bit more with that in terms of having ethnic and religious strife within their country in terms of actively outgrouping. But a lot of the countries that we'll be talking about, Ireland, Japan to some extent, though they haven't really been fully tested on that, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Vietnam, don't have these issues. And so they are more pluralistic and generally pretty open-minded countries in terms of differing viewpoints. Maybe not politically, but at least ethnically and religiously, they are more pluralistic. So that is one thing that I've noticed there, is that these do, even those countries that have some issues with that, or that have struggled with that since, they are multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and that's why there's an issue there. So that's one thing that we see with Gemini, is that there's always a multiplicity. And so when we're talking about nation and we're talking about populations that are ruled by those nations, we do see that play out in terms of there's multiple ethnicities that are native to a nation, or there are multiple ways of looking at religion. For instance, with Vietnam, they famously have multiple forms of Buddhism and always have. Like pretty much since Buddhism arrived, it's come in multiple forms, and it has coexisted quite well for the most part, of course. And then with the Levantine countries that we have here, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, we have sometimes more Sunni than Shia in these countries, but they're generally better off when it comes to those matters in terms of being accepting of different types. And Ireland is also generally known for, although struggling recently in a way that deeply, deeply frustrates me as an Irish American, being very, very open to different types of people because of the fact that there were people like me who came from them and had to go to a different country, you know. So that is a bit of a common theme. And of course, number one on this list, probably in terms of a difficulty with that, is Israel is also one of these nations. So we'll get to all of that, though, as we go through the nations kind of as a list. Another major thing that we want to keep in mind with most of these nations is we can look to the US for precedent here, but this is the first Uranus return of most of these nations and entities, all of them really, except for the US, that we will be looking at. So this is a very important one. This is, for instance, what the US was going through in terms of its first Uranus return was the Civil War. So things can be shaken in a very fundamental way where you have to throw the book of everything that is precedent out the window, because there's no precedent for a given situation, and you just need to respond to it in the moment as its own case, as its own circumstance. And there's then a lot of pressure that also comes with that. So let us move on to some more thoughts about this that came up for me. And this is just kind of an initial study of it. This is something that I promise you is not going to leave my mind for years now. I have kind of come to accept the fact that I even really want to personally dive into the history of the 1940s a lot more as Uranus is moving into Gemini, to really get a feel even more so for that time. I've studied it quite a bit, but there's a lot more that I could get into with it and how that kind of shaped everything now. So this is something that we'll be talking about more, but just some off the bat initial thoughts. Beyond even Uranus in Gemini, the fact that the countries that we'll be going through here required independence, geopolitically required independence, it sparked a level of decolonization, obviously, that we haven't seen. But we additionally hadn't been seeing a lot of decolonization just shortly before this. Again, we saw ramping up of aggression toward colonies throughout the period just leading up to this, including in the war, as colonies were trampled over. North Africa was trampled over, the whole South Pacific and East Asia, you know, was just completely trampled over throughout the period due to the fact that World War II was occurring, having, you know, through no fault of their own, really. And so what we see that I find pretty fascinating is that we see not only the decolonization of some of the countries that we're going to be talking about, most of them really were countries that gained independence after having been colonized, but there was then a slew of other countries that have Uranus and Cancer after Uranus and Gemini. These came through in like the 50s, the early 50s mostly. So China, Libya, Laos, Cambodia, Sudan, Tunisia, these countries have a national signature of Uranus and Cancer. And one thing that's relatively fascinating with most of these countries, not all, but most certainly, is they are more protective than the countries that we'll be talking about today. So they did insulate a little bit more in order to kind of cultivate their own sense of nationalism post-colonial, you know? And so that has with it, therefore, a flavor of that Uranus and Cancer, which can kind of help us to distinguish again what is Uranus in Gemini. And then we have also many nations have Uranus in Leo and Virgo in the late 50s into the 60s. Much of Africa has this because of the series of additional countries that became decolonized throughout that period of time as well. One thing that definitely stood out to me is a lot of Franco-African countries have that Uranus and Leo, which is interesting because of the association. Obviously, lions are from Africa or Kenya, if a very stupid, cute meme video from my youth is to be believed. Then that is obviously an association there, but, and this goes beyond just the countries that were freed, but there is that association with the lion among a lot of those countries as well, which I just thought was kind of cute. So there is, with this placement, it has a history of independence and equality movements, without a doubt. This is something that we see just in stark relief that I think is actually really pretty beautiful about it. It has been for good, for the most part. Not perfect, never perfect. Things actually seem to improve a lot as it moves beyond that sign and carries with it a lot of what started then. Like I'm pointing out about decolonization, obviously all of these countries that I've mentioned here were still colonies throughout the entire Uranus and in Gemini period. So it's not that this is, you know, some sort of magic bullet and it fixes all of the world's problems, but it does clear a lot of things up in order to get them out of the way of greater equality each time that we see it. So again, taking this back through each Uranus return and each time that Uranus has been in Gemini from a US perspective, this was when the yoke of the overseas version of tyranny was thrown off, certainly. And then also the yoke of slavery was thrown off. And then the getting involved in the throwing the yoke of the German power that I will try not to refer to directly, just in case it's a problem for the algorithm, off of Europe, and then therefore eventually all of their colonies as well. And some of that, unfortunately, took on different forms that were in themselves pretty disgusting through the 70s, but certainly a major improvement in terms of shutting down all of the fascist countries for the most part, depending on how broadly you take that term, and then also, you know, Imperial Japan. But additionally, even with this peculiarity of Uranus and Gemini that is really wonderful, we do need to keep in mind that this is generally revolutionary in the way that it plays out. Again, it's almost as though Uranus creates something when it is in Taurus, which is pre-existing, but it seems to ramp it up when it's in Taurus. And then it has to then be fought against as something that's still existing by this ingress into Gemini here. So it's a very just standalone Uranus and Gemini is something that I think is very hugely significant globally speaking, and also for humanity. I think it is a wonderful placement, but it does bring with it a need to fight. And so that I think is something that we're also going to be seeing play out with this. Now, getting into, okay, what all was created in the 40s here under this placement. And I do want to point out, I don't have my exact dates here, but we had this actually for a pretty long time. So it first ingressed in 1941 and it last left the sign in 1949. So we actually, when I was referring to China, that's also 1949, if I am remembering correctly, but it was beyond the period of Uranus in Gemini. Though it might be 1950, because I think theirs is like at 4 degrees of Cancer. So I digress. let's get into who we're talking about here. So we have the United Nations, NATO, and the World Bank. I mean, these are basically the big players of the global order since World War II. These are hugely significant institutions, and they are going to be going through their first Uranus return, which is a little bit unsettling in a sense here. We will probably see a huge shakeup with all of these institutions. Some of them might not last. Some of them may need to take on a relatively radical change in order to survive. That is what a Uranus return demands, is that there is a huge amount of change if you want for something to continue. But these will be ultimately fundamentally changed in the coming years. And another thing I should have clarified is by in the coming years, I mean, we will have this from 2025 through 2033. So this is the period of time that we're talking about. Now, we will see that World Bank come under pressure a little sooner than these others. And I think that that makes sense. You know, generally speaking, people are pretty fed up with the monetary systems of their countries generally, and then that which is even imposed upon their countries in the form of structural adjustment programs and so on and so forth, which allow for the World Bank through the IMF, through the loans that they give to countries. They hinge those loans that are desperately needed by countries, mostly countries that were formerly colonized, that have been economically held back for a very long period of time and that may still not have control over their own resources. They typically demand that a lot of the social programs in those countries be dismantled because, God forbid, they cost money to take care of their societies. Additionally, they will often demand that the natural resources of the countries should be able to be bought and sold by foreign entities, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge problem here with the World Bank and the IMF, and that's part of the reason that the BRICS nations have come together and they're trying to create their own development bank, which is going to offer an alternative. Will it stay any better than the IMF in terms of will they start introducing structural adjustment programs as this is what the loans that we will offer nations will then hinge on? That may be just as much of a problem, but the World Bank is going to be coming under pressure, and we can see very likely the shape of this arising with BRICS currently. And it shouldn't be much surprise that not only will the World Bank, which is very much dollar dominated and dollar dominating in terms of the fact that it is one of the ways in which the US dollar remains dominant in terms of foreign trades that have nothing to do with the United States still being delineated in dollars, which props up the US dollar and is part of the reason why our currency is so strong. The World Bank and the United States will be going through very intense periods of this Uranus return simultaneously. And again, we can see the shape of this already. This is very likely BRICS. I don't personally see how it could be much other than that, but Uranus always surprises us. So maybe it will come in some additional form as well. Now, additionally, NATO will be having some trouble. So could this play out as one thing that we see with countries that start to try to push new independent currencies is that they tend to get overthrown by the US and by NATO. I mean, this is unfortunately just a fact. I don't mean to just put down the US. I do have a great deal of affection for this country, but when it comes to certain figures who have tried to introduce independent currencies or currencies for trading that would be alternative to the dollar, there tends to be wars, and they so far have tended to be eliminated. But this could indicate that there's a lot of pressure coming to the monetary system that has been dominated by the West and by the United States, through which it is enabled to attach strings to other countries and control the internal affairs of other countries, which therefore also includes matters of you need to allow for our private companies or Canadian private companies or German or British private companies to come in and buy up your national resources and sell them with virtually no benefit to you. If that comes under pressure from BRICS, that could, and I don't mean to fearmonger here, I am a major cheerleader of there is full agency. We can do whatever we choose. We can avoid any war that we want. That could lead to some sort of NATO-involved conflict over those matters, as well as other matters of general political, geopolitical control and multipolarism and all of these issues that are coming up. We could see that currency come under a great deal of pressure and have that push us into these kinds of conflicts that may really stretch the United Nations and its ability to respond to a situation, as well as NATO itself, if things go pretty badly. Now, it is worth noting, one, for better or worse, the US has won wars with Uranus and Gemini and hasn't lost wars with that placement. But considering the fact that we are dealing with NATO and not Chinese or Russian or whoever else we would want to be messing with, going through Uranus returns during this period of time, it does give you a little bit of pause. Now, on the other side, they are dealing with a weird signature of their own, which is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which we will also cover in another video coming up, which has a lot to do with major changes in Russia, as well to some extent as China. So getting into the nations that have this in their charts, and I do want to invite, if you know any other nations that have this placement, whether they have some sort of fundamental, like foundational date back around the 1770s or in approximately the 1860s or in the 1940s, please do let me know, because there's no way that this list is exhaustive. It's just what I've been able to personally find. Also, if you have any additional or conflicting data when it comes to any of these countries, I very much invite that as well. In particular, I'm very annoyed about the fact that I don't have a time for Vietnam, because it was very clearly when Ho Chi Minh made a specific speech, and there's a video of it, but I just don't know when that was. So if anyone has that time, I would very much appreciate that too. But all of that aside, so in terms of chronological order, this is how we have these countries with these foundational dates. We have the United States back in 1776, of course. We have Lebanon in 1943, Syria in either 45 or 46, depending on whether you take the agreement for independence or the date that the independence came into effect. Either way, they have Uranus in Gemini. It's just as it at 17 degrees, or it retrograded meantime to 15 degrees. We have Indonesia with this, it placed in its 9th house of foreign affairs, but also religious perspectives and spirituality, the judicial system, universities. I would not be surprised to see some sort of uprising within the context of universities. There may be a huge amount of foreign influence of a new type, because this is Uranus in Gemini, and matters along these lines very, very likely coming up in a super sharp and pressurized way for Indonesia in the coming years. Again, we have Vietnam in 1945 on the 2nd of September, and that's at 17 degrees. We have Jordan at 16 degrees, 25th of May, 46. Japan, we have a very precise time for, which I love. And this again, so this is a perfect example of, this is a chart that is taken as a major Japanese foundational chart, despite the fact that Japan already existed and does have other charts. So this is like the current iteration of Japan. This is the chart for modern Japan, but that doesn't mean that previous charts don't additionally hold. It's just that they are a nation that carries the signature of Uranus and Gemini as well. So we have that with the Diet passing their current constitution during this period of time. Additionally, we have Pakistan at 25 degrees for 14th of August, 1947. And this is a good chart. This is the correct time, it would seem. We have Myanmar at 23 degrees for the 4th of January, 1948. This is potentially not the greatest because I don't have a specific source for it. I'm taking someone's word for it. Sri Lanka as well at 22 degrees, the 4th of February, 1948. And this is a good chart, 6 a.m. if you want to look at that chart. Israel at 24 degrees, also in the ninth house. Major potential judicial issues coming up for Israel during this period of time. I do want to point out that for a lot of countries, and likely for all of these countries plus some, I will be looking at the ingresses of all of the outer planets into their new signs within the context of different countries, because Israel actually has a huge, questionable, very difficult set of transits that it's about to go through. Not only its Uranus return, but additionally, it is about to have Pluto oppose a huge amount of its placements. So that will be quite significant, and it will be trying times for them in coming years. Theirs is for 14th of May, 1948 at 4 p.m. Tel Aviv, and this is as solid a chart as I can find, and I've spent quite a bit of time like looking for if there's anything better, and no, that seems quite solid. So ninth house, again, all of those issues that I mentioned, potentially protests coming up with regard to their university students and on universities, judicial issues coming up, questions, of course, around religion, questions around foreign countries and their influence there. Potentially also with both Indonesia, which also has this, and Israel, potentially involvement of foreign courts, which are also very much represented by the ninth house. And that is a theme that I've been seeing come up with Israel quite a bit as well. Now, as far as Ireland is concerned, I do want to point out just quickly for the astrologers here, Nick Campion has a slightly different time here, and I don't know why. And so if you do, then please do let me know, and we can discuss it, because he has the 17th of April at 11 p.m., but the Republic became completely de jure independent, recognized on all sides at midnight on the 18th. And I was like, is there some sort of weird time difference between Dublin and London that I was unaware of? And I can't find that. So I am going to go with all reports, which is midnight on the 18th. The 18th is considered their Independence Day as well. So I'll just take it as that. But if that's the case, sadly, in that hour of time, the rising sign changed. So with that under consideration, we have it in the 7th house. If for some reason Nick Campion is correct, then it would be in the 8th. But for now, we'll take it as the 7th, but that would be coming later. So, you know, Ireland generally doesn't involve itself in wars. It's not a NATO member, but with that 7th house there, it does concern me a little bit about both of these potentially getting involved in warlike matters, because of the fact that the US always does, and we have ours in the 7th house as well. So just something to keep in mind there. But it does also, it additionally really revolutionizes how industry interacts with government, how government interacts with the people, how industry interacts with the people, how the country relates to other countries, generally speaking. So especially in the case of Ireland, where you wouldn't think that they would get involved in a situation like that, it might just be these kinds of really fundamental questions around, for one thing, who belongs and who doesn't. I know that there is a rather supremacist-oriented movement there that is not natural to Ireland. And again, I will only ever, slam in the strongest terms, as that's not a native reaction to immigration that has arisen. And there may be some questions that arise around that, and also around immigration generally for the country, and how the country relates to people who have come in as either immigrants or as asylum seekers there, that could definitely come to a major head in the coming years as well. So a little bit more on what we can expect from this Uranus and Gemini for the countries in which it is a return will be almost without a doubt these kind of equality movements. So again, as we've seen, this is associated with the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the fight against fascism, with decolonization, with expansion of the role of women in many, many different countries, especially out of necessity due to the fact that the war was going on in this last one. But we did see women's involvement in the other wars also that the United States has had during these periods previous be extremely fundamental during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War as well. And those certainly had some impact on not only the way that they were seen after the Revolutionary War, maybe not so much the greatest, but certainly after the Civil War, you know, the involvement in women in abolition movements and the association that it also had with the women's rights movements that arose within the 19th century and were further, you know, inspired by abolition for suffrage and so on and so forth. This is clearly something that is quite fundamental to Uranus and Gemini, and we'll see a lot of that everywhere. But what I want to emphasize here is that there's kind of no getting away from this in the countries that are having returns. So this is something that we can certainly expect to be dealing with, is big fights around equality. And this may be either coordinated or spontaneous. It may happen relatively organically, or it may be a top-down effort that has to be made, as with the case in the States for pretty much every period. There was a lot of government involvement in pushing that progress, which is pretty interesting because that's not necessarily something that we always see in the States. So again, something that we will see in these countries, definitely disruption, riots, dissidents. We'll see chaos, potentially disasters, whether they are natural or caused by people, either doing things to bring attention to something or for very nefarious reasons, potentially. We could see war for seventh house Uranus nations, but that doesn't have to be the case. Again, I will always preach agency, even though the more that I look at these years coming up, the less likely it seems to me of avoiding it. But we will see a rise in questions around individualism and activism. That is something that does come up with these returns, is how individuals can contribute to a cause. That's one thing that Uranus really brings up big time. And then certainly in a very socially oriented and relatively kind of justice oriented sign like Gemini, that is something that will definitely come up, but it will be interesting to see yet again how we do balance that individualism with the equality aspects that are coming in, as well as how other countries do that have somewhat different perspectives on all of these things. Now, for these Uranus and Gemini returns, we've only seen it play out in a US context before. And so, like I was saying, we can take that as precedent. We can take that as something to look to inform us on some of the ways that it will play out for all of these different countries. But we don't really have Uranus returns in Gemini to look to in other countries, in other cultures, in other parts of the world where there are different perspectives on things, where the worldview isn't one of this kind of Western liberal mindset, you know, because mindset has really a lot to do with the way that Uranus plays out. It has absolutely everything to do with ideology and how that's informed and how it plays out. It also has a huge role in changing it. So we will see this finally play out in many, many different ways and get a much clearer picture of what Uranus and Gemini actually means as these countries go through their Uranus returns in Gemini that aren't just the US. We always go to war, but that's something that we tend to do anyway. So, I mean, it'll hopefully and probably play out for other countries in somewhat different ways as they grapple with this signature coming to the fore for them in a very extreme, very highly pressurized way that will transform their country. They will hopefully have that play out in their own unique way. And what this pressure, this really intense pressure that we will see play out, especially in the context of the house that Uranus is placed in natally, an absolutely unavoidable need to reorganize, restructure, revision, possibly by taking something fully apart. And I say that in the most passive way possible. We could see, for instance, revolutions where a government is potentially overthrown. And there may be a need to restructure from the ground up. And for others, if, for instance, governments are more responsive to this pressure, then that need to reorganize and to revision doesn't necessarily have to play out as a complete and total crisis, but maybe just a crisis that has to be grappled with and that can be addressed by changing a very fundamental structure within the country, within the context of the society that addresses a deep-seated dissatisfaction that is calling for a huge change within each of these countries. And again, I do want to emphasize, it's not only these countries and these institutions that have this as a signature. If you were to take, for instance, liberation charts for a huge amount of countries that were occupied throughout this period of time and that then were no longer occupied in specific ways, or even four nations that became occupied, for instance, Germany, under this placement, they would also have liberation charts, even though it's not for instance, a national natal chart like I'm trying to look at here in terms of questions of the fundamental independence of a nation that is finally fully recognized, or the recognition of a country, basically coming into form or being carved up as, definitely played out with some of the Arab states that were subjected to, British and French mandates and so forth, where the countries were cut up. All the countries that were liberated during this period of time, they also have some of the signature underlying. And not only that, but really, this is a signature of post-war history. We're kind of going through the Uranus return of the post-war global order, as we can see by the fact that we have these fundamental institutions that still control the form and the dialogue, the possibility, the daring of every nation on Earth, certainly. Some of these literally actually controlling the economies of, if I were to just guess, I would say, 2/3 at least of the world directly, and then really everyone indirectly, because there are so many countries that would take a different tack if they weren't afraid of the fallout from either IMF or from NATO. And so that entire order is coming up on a Uranus return. And this is going to shift fundamentally, and even just politically, even just putting aside the astrology in terms of my own general worldview. And of course, this is particular to me, but it does worry me that these Uranian themes that we see coming up for the US, just even in the world, the hegemony coming under question, as it always has been, but in a very serious way right now. And the reactiveness of the US in particular to it, but then also its friends in NATO. The unwillingness to release the grip on other nations' economies by continuing to insist upon, via the IMF, pushing, dollar hegemony. If we could just release our grasp on that and address our economy, our own economy, as the dollar inevitably falls, in a way where we're not focused in the same way that we have been this for most of this post-war period, but to be perfectly honest, in the beginning of the post-war period, we didn't have this corporations and banks get everything and everyone else gets nothing kind of attitude in terms of our economy. During this period of time, in fact, if a company was considered to not be acting in the interests of the public, the government, the US government, could simply take over that company and do with it as it needed. We used to break up trusts, we used to have a decent tax rate on corporations and on the, absurdly wealthy. And it has slipped, of course, since then. Another part of our problem in this country, in my view, I'm just going to soapbox for a little bit. I'm sorry. Maybe some of you aren't familiar or haven't caught on to what my worldview is generally, but if you haven't, I hope that this isn't, offensive to you in any way. But the fact that we have also Pluto in Capricorn, power in a financial house, in our second house in our natal chart, a financial house, is a very unfortunate signature that we have. Now, we have also just gone through and are now wrapping up from now through the end of November, through election time, of course, our Pluto return, which is really not only bringing to the fore for everyone to see and either accept or reject, but not pretend that they can't see it anymore, the fact that it is financial elites that absolutely control our politics and our policy and our foreign policy in this country. The fact that we're going directly from a Pluto return to a Uranus return is really quite fascinating, and really just kind of points to the fact that dissatisfaction that has grown since 2008, since Pluto entered Capricorn and kind of began our sign-based Pluto return, which has just been letting off this year, but it's currently in Capricorn as well. That dissatisfaction that we are now very, very aware of, and we really can't pretend that we're not aware of it, at least anymore, is really going to come to the fore with this Uranus in Gemini. It's a real problem. The fact that so many of us on all sides, regardless of what we see in terms of sides to be the solution to the problem, pretty much everyone agrees that the problem is billionaires, to just kind of put it plainly, and their control, the fact that they have an unfounded and undue amount of control over our society, which is meant to be in our control in a democracy. This isn't supposed to be a plutocracy. It's just that it is, and now we see that, and we're very dissatisfied, but people don't really know what to do. Well, Uranus and Gemini, especially conjuncting our own Uranus and our own kind of perspective on the fact that sometimes society needs a huge shakeup in order to correct things, that's going to be very strongly triggered. And that, combined with the fact that we're going to be dealing also with a world that is very dissatisfied with the fact that the US dollar and Western corporations are dominating their economies and have the majority of the world population living in extreme poverty, for instance, despite the fact that there is absolutely plenty for everyone. It's just a matter of how it's distributed. In addition to the fact that through NATO, this is enforced militarily. This is all really going to be coming to a head in these coming years. And it's very frustrating to me that for some reason, our ruling class just can never get enough, these little hungry ghosts that run our global order right now, essentially. And they're never satiated. They can never just say, okay, that's enough for now. Let's let off the gas a little bit, so that things can stabilize. They just constantly rely on everyone else to just be okay with them taking more and more and more. It's clearly not sustainable politically, but additionally, looking at the astrology, it is fully reinforced in these coming years with the ingress of these various planets, which I will link to a video that I did covering the fact that all of these outer planets are changing in a way that is absolutely world historical in terms of its significance and its impact. It's so clear that this is going to change regardless of how tightly they try to grasp onto these things. And it's going to be a question of how much fighting there is over it. And when we start fighting over these things, no one's really going to come out a winner. Things may change in a way that is potentially beneficial in the end, but no one wins because there's always going to be a lot of harm done. And usually it is those among our own populations that are participating, as well as those among populations that have absolutely nothing to do with it, that typically suffer in these kinds of situations. So it would be nice if we could get through this without a fight, but that's not how Uranus in Gemini has gone before. And that's usually also not how Uranus returns play out as well. So to reiterate something that I think we all sense is coming, and the astrology, for better or worse, really perfectly lays out. It's going to be an intense several years. Again, we will have Uranus in this placement for about 7-8 years, but it's going to play out for as long as it needs to play out for. We also have Neptune and Pluto about to change signs and enter into a very similar kind of attitude, which is very different from the attitude that these planets have had in recent years of kind of allowing for things to just continue to carry on in the same old way that it always has. These new placements will not allow for things to carry on in those ways, but I do sadly want to reiterate that it's not that we're just going to spontaneously enlighten. I think that these placements are wonderful. I think that I've gotten that across, and I always want to reiterate that. But the thing is that they do imply a lot of strife and possibly some scary times. But I think it's going to be really important. One thing that we have now that we didn't have really before these various wars is we now do have these outer planets to look to in terms of the patterns that it has made, but also with some understanding of them. You know, Pluto had just been discovered prior to World War II. Uranus had just been discovered around the time of the Revolutionary War, you know. So we do have this to look to know that it's not all for naught, that we're basically being kind of put into this position of things are going to have to change a whole lot in the coming decade or two. And it's going to come with a huge amount of pressure for us, but it's for the best. And it's a fight that's worth having, essentially. Not necessarily international fight so much, but questioning leadership in many countries, and certainly in the West, and certainly questioning the way that the United Nations has played out with the Security Council, and questioning the way that Western hegemony is held, questioning the fact that we still have structural adjustment programs like 20, 30 years after it's been just so thoroughly known that this is unbelievably problematic, and so on and so forth. So I will wrap it up now. Sorry to go on a rant, but I have been told by people to kind of take the foot off the brakes anyway when it comes to this channel. So maybe I just will a little bit more incoming videos, certainly in future live streams and so forth. So yes, thank you so much for being here. Again, if you would like to help out and don't mind hitting the like button, I very, very much appreciate that. If you want to share this video with anyone, I thank you so much for doing that as well. And do stick around by subscribing if you're new here. I would very much love to have you here for future videos. Again, if you have any thoughts on live stream ideas, it may be this Sunday or next Sunday that I start them. I will do a little like premiere thing or have something up for a couple days in advance to let people know when I go live. But a lot of what I want to do with that is, again, I'll probably cover the transits for the upcoming week, but I additionally just kind of want to either tease out some topics that have come to mind or some things along these kinds of lines that I've seen play out, or possibly each week throw out some predictions and see the next week if they held or not, just kind of have a little bit more fun with it in those ways. And also possibly like any topics that you guys want elucidated, I am glad to cover those as well, either in live streams or like this. So always feel free to ask. But yeah, I think that's most of the bases that I wanted to cover for this video. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a beautiful time, and I will see you in the next video. Be good. Bye.